The sky above New York burned orange and red as Marcus Webb stood on the roof of the Global Emergency Command Center. The air tasted of metal and death. Below him, millions of people crowded the streets, all looking up at the same terrifying sight. The sun was getting bigger and angrier every day. Dr. Lisa Morgan rushed through the heavy metal doors behind him. Her white coat was stained with coffee and sweat. She had been working for 3 days straight without sleep. The numbers on her tablet showed what everyone already knew, but nobody wanted to say out loud. Earth was dying. "The magnetic field is gone," she said, her voice shaking. "The solar storm stripped it away completely. We have maybe 6 months before the atmosphere burns off." Marcus nodded slowly. He had been the director of global affairs for 10 years, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The planet that had been home to humans for millions of years was becoming uninhabitable. The choice was simple: leave or die. "How many ships do we have?" he asked. 12. Maybe 13 if Jake Sullivan can get that last one working. Captain Jake Sullivan was 3 miles underground in the shipyard that used to be the subway tunnels of Manhattan. The massive colony ship New Horizons stretched out in front of him like a metal mountain. Workers crawled over its hull like ants, welding and cutting and praying that their work would hold together long enough to reach the stars. Kate Bennett wiped grease from her hands as she climbed down from the engine compartment. She had designed the fusion drives that would power the ship, but building them with salvaged parts was like trying to perform surgery with a kitchen knife. Everything had to work perfectly, or 50,000 people would die in the cold darkness of space. "How long?" Jake asked her. 2 weeks. Maybe 3 if we can find more uranium. Jake looked at the calendar on his wrist. They had 6 weeks before the planet became too dangerous to leave. 12 ships for 8 billion people. The math was cruel and simple. Most of humanity would never see the stars. Dr. Alan Foster walked through the medical bay, checking supplies and equipment. As the chief medical officer for the New Horizon, he would be responsible for keeping 50,000 people alive during a journey that might last years or decades. He had loaded the ship with every medicine and piece of equipment he could find, but space was limited and the unknown was vast. The selection process had been the hardest part. Every person on Earth wanted a seat on the ships, but there was only room for 600,000. The computers had chosen based on skills, genetics, and luck. Families were split apart. Children were separated from parents. It was the most heartbreaking lottery in human history. Amy Clark helped load the last of the food supplies into the cargo bay. She was a logistics officer, which meant she had to figure out how to feed 50,000 people for an unknown number of years with a limited amount of space. Every meal had been calculated, every calorie counted. There was no room for waste or error. Above them, the Kethver Empire watched from their invisible ships. They had been monitoring Earth for decades, studying the humans like scientists studying bacteria in a petri dish. The Kethver were ancient and powerful, rulers of 1,000 worlds. They had seen many species destroy themselves, and they expected humans to do the same. Commander Zethak observed the primitive vessels taking shape in the human tunnels. The ships were crude and ugly, built from desperation rather than elegance. The humans had no idea that they were being watched, no knowledge that their solar system was considered Kethver territory. When the time came, the Empire would decide whether these fleeing mammals deserved to live or die. Marcus Webb made the announcement on a Tuesday morning. Every screen on Earth showed his tired face as he spoke the words that would end human civilization. As they knew it, "My fellow humans, we must leave our home. The ships will launch in 30 days. Those who have been selected should report to their assigned departure points immediately." The riots started within hours. Cities burned as people fought for seats that did not exist. The military tried to keep order, but how do you control 8 billion desperate people with only 600,000 escape pods? Jake Sullivan watched the chaos from the command bridge of the New Horizon. The ship was ready, loaded with everything they could carry and everyone they could save. The fusion engines hummed with power, waiting for the signal to lift humanity into the unknown. Kate Bennett ran final checks on the navigation systems. They had identified several possible destinations, planets that might support human life. But the journey would be long and dangerous, and there was no guarantee that any of them would be suitable for colonization. The day of departure arrived with little ceremony. The ships lifted off from hidden launch sites around the world, their engines burning bright against the dying sky. 50,000 souls aboard each vessel, carrying the hopes and dreams of an entire species. As Earth grew smaller behind them, the refugees looked forward into the darkness, not knowing that they were taking their first steps on a path that would lead them to become the most powerful force in the galaxy. The human fleet had been drifting through space for 7 years when the first ship died. The Freedom's Dream suffered a catastrophic engine failure that left 15,000 people trapped in a metal coffin, slowly freezing to death in the void. Commander Roy Patterson watched helplessly as his sister ship went dark. Knowing that his own vessel was running on borrowed time, Lieutenant Amy Clark stood in the cargo bay of the New Horizon, counting food supplies that seemed to shrink every day. The original calculations had been based on a 5-year journey to the nearest habitable system, but space was vast and their maps were incomplete. Children born on the ships had never seen sunlight or breathed fresh air. Some of the older passengers whispered that maybe they should have stayed on Earth and died with dignity. The riots started on the Liberty Bell during the 8th year. Hungry families broke into the food storage areas, fighting over protein bars and recycled water. Captain Jake Sullivan received the distress call at 3 a.m, ship time. He made the hardest decision of his life and ordered the rebels to be locked in the lower decks without food for 3 days. Order was restored, but the cost was measured in broken friendships and shattered trust. Kate Bennett worked 8 an hour. Shifts in the engine room, keeping the fusion reactors running with spare parts that were increasingly hard to find. Every day brought new problems. Coolant leaks, computer failures, hull breaches that had to be patched with whatever materials they could scavenge. The ships were falling apart around them, and there was nowhere to land for repairs. Dr. Alan Foster had lost count of how many people had died under his care. The old and the weak went first, followed by those who simply lost the will to live. He performed surgery by flashlight when the power failed, delivered babies in zero gravity, and held the hands of dying patients who asked him to remember their names. The medical bay had become a place of constant sorrow. In the 9th year, long-range sensors detected something impossible. A signal from deep space, artificial and clearly intelligent. The discovery sent waves of excitement through the fleet. They were not alone in the universe, and maybe, just maybe, they had found someone who could help them. The signal led them to a small blue world orbiting a red star. As they approached, alien ships rose to meet them. The vessels were sleek and beautiful, nothing like the crude human ships that limped toward them on failing engines. Commander Roy Patterson found himself face to face with the first alien beings humanity had ever encountered. The aliens called themselves the Torvan Republic. They were tall and thin, with silver skin and large black eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. Their leader, a being who identified himself as Ambassador Kethalan, spoke to the humans through a translation device that turned his musical language into understandable words. "You are far from home, little ones," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and pity. "What brings you to our territory?" Ambassador Helen Price had been chosen to speak for humanity because of her skills in diplomacy and her ability to stay calm under pressure. She told the Torvan leader about Earth's destruction, about the long journey through space, about the ships that were dying and the people who needed help. She spoke honestly about human desperation and the hope that had brought them so far from home. The Torvans listened with patience that seemed to stretch across centuries. They had seen many species rise and fall, had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. Humans were not the first refugees to seek their help, and they would not be the last. After 3 days of discussion, the Torvans made their decision. They would allow the humans to settle on Kepler 442b, a mining world at the edge of their territory. It was not paradise, but it had air to breathe and water to drink. Most importantly, it was solid ground beneath their feet after 15 years of metal walls and recycled air. Dr. Carl Mason was the first human to step onto alien soil. The chief scientist knelt down and picked up a handful of red dirt, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Behind them, thousands of refugees streamed out of the colony ships, many of them crying at the sensation of wind on their faces and the smell of growing things. The Torvins were generous hosts. Sharing their technology and knowledge freely, they taught humans how to build fusion reactors that actually worked, how to grow food in alien soil, how to repair their ships with materials that were stronger than anything Earth had ever produced. In return, the humans offered their labor and their gratitude, but the Torvins were not the only power in this part of the galaxy. The HFY Empire had been watching the proceedings with growing anger. To them, the humans were nothing more than vermin infesting their territory. The Empire had rules about primitive species, and those rules did not include mercy. Commander Zithak prepared his battle fleet for a simple mission. The humans and their Torvin protectors would be given one chance to surrender. If they refused, the Empire would demonstrate why they had ruled the galaxy for over 1,000 years. The human refugees had found temporary safety among the stars, but their greatest test was yet to come. General Steve Adams had never seen Earth, but he dreamed of blue skies and green grass that his parents described in whispered stories. He was born on the New Horizon during the 3rd year of the journey, one of the first generation of humans, to know only the metal walls of spacecraft and the red dirt of alien worlds. At 25, he commanded the defense forces of the human settlements on Kepler 442b, with a mind that understood war in ways his elders could not imagine. The message from the HFY Empire arrived on a Tuesday morning, broadcast on all frequencies with the cold authority of absolute power. Commander Zethak's image filled every screen in the human colonies. His insectoid features twisted with disgust as he delivered the ultimatum that would change everything. "Primitive mammals," he began, his voice like grinding metal. "You have infested Torvin territory with the permission of weak-minded fools. The HFY Empire has ruled this galaxy for 1,000 years, and we do not tolerate vermin in our domain. You have 48 hours to board your pathetic ships and leave this system. Those who remain will be exterminated." Ambassador Helen Price had spent 5 years building relationships with the Torvin Republic, learning their customs and earning their trust. She stood in the council chamber of their capital city, surrounded by silver-skinned beings whose ancient eyes held wisdom beyond human understanding. The Torvin leaders were afraid, and Helen could not blame them. The HFY Empire had destroyed entire civilizations for smaller offenses. "We cannot protect you," Ambassador Kefalin said, his musical voice heavy with sorrow. "The Empire commands 10,000 warships. We have perhaps 50 vessels suitable for combat. To fight them would mean the death of both our species." But General Steve Adams had a different idea. He had studied every piece of Torvin technology, every tactical manual, every historical record of HFY military doctrine. The Empire was powerful, but they were also arrogant. They had not faced a real challenge in centuries, and arrogance made even the strongest enemy vulnerable. Nicole White worked alongside Steve in the command center that had been built into the caves beneath the human settlement. She was a diplomat by training, but 15 years of refugee life had taught her that sometimes words were not enough. The HFY did not negotiate with species they considered inferior. They only understood strength. "We fight," Steve announced to the assembled human leaders. "Not because we can win, but because running away is no longer an option. We have been refugees long enough." The preparation took every hour of the 48 they had been given. Kate Bennett worked with Torvin engineers to retrofit the human ships with better weapons and shields. The colony vessels that had carried them from Earth were never meant for war, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Every tool became a weapon. Every civilian became a potential soldier. Commander Tyler Brooks climbed into the cockpit of a fighter that had been assembled from spare parts and salvaged materials. He was 23 years old and had never seen combat, but he understood flying in ways that amazed even the Torvins. Human reflexes were faster than any species in the galaxy, and their ability to process multiple threats simultaneously made them natural pilots. Major Rachel Davis led the ground forces that would defend the colony if the space battle failed. She had trained civilians to use weapons, organized evacuation procedures, and prepared for a siege that might last months. The older refugees remembered the desperation of leaving Earth, but these young humans had been forged by hardship into something harder and more determined. Chief Engineer Greg Johnson had performed miracles with the colony ships, turning passenger vessels into fighting machines. The weapons were crude and the armor was thin, but the ships could move and fight in ways that no one expected. Human engineering had always been about making the impossible work with whatever materials were available. The Kethver fleet arrived. Exactly on schedule, 300 sleek warships that moved through space with the confidence of predators who had never known defeat. Commander Zathak expected to find empty space and fleeing refugees. Instead, he found 47 human ships and 12 Torvin vessels arranged in a defensive formation around the planet. "Foolish mammals," he transmitted to the human fleet. "You choose death over wisdom, so be it." The Battle of Kepler Station began with the sunrise over the human colony. The Kethver ships attacked in perfect formation, their weapons designed to overwhelm and destroy. But the humans did not fight like any enemy the Empire had faced before. They broke apart and reformed, struck from unexpected angles, used the asteroids and debris of the system as cover and weapons. Tyler Brooks found himself alone against 3 Kethver fighters, his cobbled-together ship outmatched in every way except one. He could think faster than they could react, anticipate their moves before they made them. When the battle ended, all 3 enemy ships were drifting wreckage, and Tyler was still alive. The fighting lasted for 3 days. Ships died on both sides. Brave souls lost to the darkness of space. But when the smoke cleared and the survivors counted their losses, the impossible had happened. The mighty Kethver Empire had been defeated by a handful of human refugees and their Torvin allies. "Commander." Zethak stared at the tactical display with disbelief. Half his fleet was gone, destroyed by primitives who should have been easy prey. The humans had shown him something he had never seen before, a species that grew stronger under pressure and fought hardest when defeat seemed certain, the victory. At Kepler Station sent shockwaves through the galaxy. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Kethver Empire had been humbled. And in the depths of space, other oppressed species began to whisper a name that would become legend: humanity. The news of humanity's victory at Kepler Station spread through the galaxy like wildfire, carried by traders and refugees who had witnessed the impossible. President Logan Mitchell stood in the newly constructed government building on New Hope, the first human capital established on solid ground in over 20 years. The messages arrived daily now, desperate pleas from species across the galaxy who had suffered under Kethver rule for generations. The first to contact them were the Vexani, a reptilian species whose homeworld had been strip-mined by the Empire for rare metals. Their ambassador, a scarred warrior named Sektar, arrived on a battered cargo ship with 50 of his people. They offered their knowledge of Kethver military installations in exchange for protection and alliance. "We have waited 300 years for someone to stand against them," Sektar said, his yellow eyes burning with ancient hatred. "Your victory has given us hope we thought was lost forever." Admiral Chris Thompson commanded the human fleet from the Bridge of the Defiance, a warship built from the salvaged remains of 3 colony ships. The vessel was ugly and asymmetrical, but it could fight and survive in ways that impressed even veteran space captains. Chris had been a cargo pilot before the war, but desperate times had made him into something the galaxy had never seen. A human military leader who understood that sometimes the best defense was a good offense. The Kethver response was swift and brutal. Emperor Kethval himself issued the order from his throne world in the galactic core. Any world that harbored humans or their allies would be burned to ashes. Any species that defied the Empire would be exterminated. The message was clear. The humans were not just rebels, they were a disease that needed to be eliminated. The first target was the Torvan Republic. The Empire sent a fleet of 500 ships to destroy the silver-skinned beings who had dared to help the human refugees. But the Torvans were no longer defenseless. Human engineers had upgraded their ships with new weapons and armor, while human tacticians had taught them strategies that the Kethver had never encountered. Intelligence. Chief Maria Santos worked from a hidden base in the asteroid belt, coordinating with resistance movements across dozens of worlds. She had learned to speak 7 alien languages and understand the complex politics of species that had been enemies for millennia. The humans had become more than warriors. They were diplomats, uniting scattered rebels into a force that could challenge the Empire. The war escalated quickly. The Kethver attacked human settlements with weapons designed to kill entire populations, but the humans had learned the lessons of their refugee years. They were mobile, adaptable, and impossible to pin down. When the Empire destroyed one base, 3 more appeared in its place. Commander Tyler Brooks led a raid on a Kethvar supply depot in the Arcturus system, using tactics that would have been impossible for any other species. His pilots flew through asteroid fields at speeds that should have been suicidal, using the rocky debris as cover while they struck at the massive supply ships. The humans had turned their desperation into a weapon that cut through Kethver formations like a knife through paper. The turning point came when the Skari joined the human alliance. They were an ancient species of energy beings who had been imprisoned by the Empire for refusing to surrender their technology. When human forces liberated their prison world, the Skari shared knowledge that changed everything. They taught humans how to build weapons that could penetrate Kethver shields, how to detect their cloaked ships, how to turn the Empire's own technology against them. Field Marshal Tony Garcia commanded the ground forces that liberated world after world from Kethver occupation. He had been a factory worker on Earth, but the years of struggle had forged him into a general who understood. That war was not just about winning battles. It was about giving hope to beings who had forgotten what freedom meant. General Linda Hayes led the assault on the Kethver fortress world of Rigel Prime, where the Empire had built weapons capable of destroying entire star systems. The battle lasted for 6 months, with human forces fighting through automated defenses and armies of enslaved species. When the fortress finally fell, the weapons were turned over to the growing alliance of free worlds. The humans had learned something important during their years as refugees. They knew what it meant to lose everything, to have no home and no hope. That knowledge made them perfect liberators, because they understood the value of freedom in ways that species who had never lost it could not imagine. Emperor Kethvel watched reports from the front lines with growing alarm. The humans were not just winning battles. They were inspiring other species to fight back. Rebellion spread through the Empire like a plague, and everywhere the humans went, they left behind worlds that would never again bow to Kethver rule. The refugee fleet that had fled a dying Earth 25 years ago had become something unprecedented in galactic history. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense, taking worlds for their own benefit. They were liberators, fighting to free others from the same hopelessness they had once known. The galaxy was changing, and the humans were leading that change. The Kethver Empire, which had seemed eternal and unbeatable, was beginning to crumble. And in the depths of space, other ancient powers were taking notice of the small species that had dared to challenge the established order. The war entered its 5th year with humanity, controlling 37 star systems and the Kethver Empire retreating from territories they had held for centuries. Field Marshal Tony Garcia stood on the observation deck of the assault ship Liberator, watching the blue-green world of Arcturus Prime grow larger in the viewport. This was the heart of Kethver military power, their primary academy where young warriors learned to terrorize the galaxy. General Linda Hayes reviewed the battle plans one final time with her staff officers. The fortress world was defended by orbital platforms, automated weapon systems, and an army of 100,000 Kethver soldiers. Intelligence reports suggested that thousands of political prisoners were being held in the deep dungeons beneath the academy, beings from dozens of species who had dared to oppose the Empire, Colonel Ben Parker led the first wave of assault troops down to the planet's surface. His transport ship shook under enemy fire as it descended through the atmosphere, but human pilots had learned to fly through conditions that would have terrified their ancestors. The dropships landed in a storm of laser fire and explosive shells, disgorging soldiers who had been trained in the harsh reality of liberation warfare. Commander Sophie Miller's fighter squadron provided air support for the ground assault, their ships dancing between the massive defense towers that rose from the fortress like metal mountains. The human fighters were still cobbled together from salvaged parts, but they moved with a grace and speed that made them almost impossible to target. Sophie had been born on the refugee ships, and she flew with the desperate skill of someone who had never known safety. The battle for Arcturus Prime was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. The Kethver defenders fought with the fury of beings who knew their empire was crumbling, while the human attackers pressed forward with the determination of those who had lost everything once and would not allow it to happen again. The fighting raged through the Academy's corridors and training grounds, leaving no corner of the fortress untouched. Dr. Alan Foster worked in field hospitals that had been set up in captured buildings, treating wounded soldiers from a dozen different species. The human alliance had grown beyond anything the refugees could have imagined, bringing together enemies who had fought each other for millennia. Under the pressure of war against the Empire, old hatreds were forgotten in favor of a common cause. The breakthrough came on the third day of fighting when human engineers discovered the entrance to the prison complex. Kate Bennett led a team of demolition experts through tunnels that had been carved from solid rock, following maps provided by Scary intelligence operatives. The prisoners they found had been held for decades, some for crimes as simple as speaking. Against the Empire, among the freed prisoners was a being who would change the course of the war. Velther was a member of the ancient Maker species, the original builders of much of the technology that the Kethver had stolen and claimed as their own. He had been imprisoned for 300 years, his knowledge locked away because it threatened the Empire's claims of technological superiority. "You fight well for such young beings," Velther told Tony Garcia as they stood in the ruins of the Academy's main hall. "But you do not yet understand the true nature of your enemy. The Kethver are not the power behind the Empire. They are merely servants of something far older and more dangerous." The revelation sent shockwaves through the human command structure. Intelligence Chief Maria Santos worked with her alien contacts to piece together the truth that had been hidden for millennia. The Kethver Empire was controlled by a race of beings known as the Harbingers, ancient entities who had ruled the galaxy from the shadows for over 10,000 years. Admiral Chris Thompson received the news while his fleet was engaged in the largest space battle of the war. 500 human and allied ships faced off against 1,000 Kethver vessels in the Rigel system, fighting for control of the Empire's primary weapons manufacturing facility. The battle raged for days, with ships burning and dying in the cold vacuum of space. The humans had learned to fight in ways that maximized their strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. They used speed and cunning instead of brute force, striking at weak points and disappearing before the enemy could respond. Human commanders like Tyler Brooks and Rachel Davis had become legends throughout the galaxy, their tactics studied by military academies on dozens of worlds. The victory at Arcturus Prime had consequences that reached far beyond the military sphere. The knowledge gained from the liberated prisoners allowed human scientists to develop new technologies that leveled the playing field with the Empire. More importantly, the rescue of beings who had been given up for dead inspired hope and species that had been crushed under Kethver rule for generations. President Logan Mitchell addressed the Galactic Liberation Council from the Capitol building on New Hope, his words broadcast to every free world in the galaxy. The human leader spoke of a future where no species would bow to tyrants, where freedom would be the birthright of every thinking being. It was a vision that had grown from the desperate dreams of Earth's refugees into something that might actually be possible. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. The Kethver Empire was no longer the unstoppable force that had terrorized the galaxy for 1,000 years. The humans had shown that even the mightiest tyrants could be defeated by those who refused to surrender their hope for a better tomorrow. As the fifth year of the war drew to a close, both sides prepared for the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the galaxy. 10 years had passed since the Battle of Arcturus Prime, and the galaxy bore little resemblance to the one that had watched humanity flee their dying world. President Emma Lewis stood in the Great Hall of the Galactic Senate on New Terra, looking out at representatives from over 300 species who had gathered to celebrate the first decade of the Democratic Galactic Federation. The HFY Empire was gone, dissolved not through conquest, but through the simple realization that their subjects no longer feared them. When the Harbingers had finally revealed themselves in the war's final year, they had found a galaxy that was no longer willing to bow to ancient powers. The Shadow Masters, who had ruled from darkness for 10 millennia, had been forced to retreat to the unknown regions beyond the galactic rim. Admiral Kelly Turner commanded the Federation fleet from her flagship, the Freedom's Voice, a massive vessel built with technology shared by dozens of species working together. She often thought about the refugee ships that had limped away from Earth 35 years ago, held together with hope and desperation. Those crude vessels had carried the seeds of something the galaxy had never seen, a democracy that included every thinking being as an equal partner. Director Paul Watson walked through the halls of the Galactic Academy on New Terra, watching young beings from hundreds of worlds learn together in classrooms that would have been impossible under the old empire. Human children sat next to Torvan scholars. Vexani engineers worked alongside Skari philosophers, and former enemies discovered that they had more in common than they had ever imagined. The Academy had become the symbol of what humanity had brought to the galaxy. Not conquest in the traditional sense, but the idea that different species could work together as equals. The humans had learned this lesson during their refugee years, when survival had depended on cooperation rather than domination. Kate Bennett had become the Federation's chief technology officer, overseeing research projects that combined the knowledge of countless civilizations. The fusion drives that had carried humans from Earth had evolved into engines that could cross the galaxy in weeks instead of years. But more importantly, the spirit of innovation that had kept the refugee fleet alive had spread to every corner of known space. Dr. Carl Mason worked in laboratories where the greatest minds of the galaxy gathered to solve problems that had plagued civilization for millennia. Disease, hunger, and poverty were becoming things of the past as species shared their knowledge freely. The humans had shown that cooperation was more powerful than competition, that helping others ultimately helped yourself. The transformation had not been easy or quick. There had been resistance from species who preferred the old ways, conflicts between groups who had been enemies for generations, and moments when it seemed like the fragile alliance might fall apart. But the humans had learned patience during their long journey through space, and they understood that real change took time. General Steve Adams had retired from military service to become an ambassador, traveling to worlds that were still learning what freedom meant. He carried with him the lessons of someone who had been born among the stars, who had never known the comfort of believing that home was permanent. Every world he visited received the same message. Freedom was not a gift to be given, but a right to be claimed and defended. The economic transformation had been as dramatic as the political one. Trade flowed freely between worlds that had been isolated for centuries, creating prosperity that reached even the poorest systems. The humans had introduced concepts like fair wages and worker protection that seemed strange to the species accustomed to slavery and exploitation. Commander Tyler Brooks now led the Federation Exploration Service, sending ships to distant galaxies to make contact with civilizations that had never heard of the HFY Empire. Each expedition carried the message that had grown from humanity's darkest hour, that every species deserved the chance to reach for the stars without fear of conquest or subjugation. The former HFY worlds had been the biggest challenge. Generations of warriors who had known only domination had to learn new ways of thinking about power and purpose. Many had joined the Federation willingly once they understood that strength could be used to protect rather than oppress. Others had chosen exile. Following their harbinger masters into the unknown, Emma Lewis addressed the Senate on the anniversary of Earth's destruction. Her words carried to every world in the Federation. She spoke of the journey that had brought them to this moment, from refugees fleeing a dying world to the builders of a galactic civilization, based on freedom and cooperation. "We did not set out to conquer the galaxy," she said, her voice echoing, "through halls that had been built by the combined efforts of 100 species. We only wanted to survive, to find a place among the stars where our children could grow up in safety. But we learned something important during our years of wandering. That survival is not enough. We must also help others to survive and thrive." The human Odyssey had begun with loss and ended with transformation. The refugees who had fled Earth in desperation had become the architects of a new galactic order, one based not on fear and domination but on hope and cooperation. The galaxy would never be the same, and perhaps that was exactly as it should be. In the end, humanity's greatest conquest had not been the defeat of the Kethra Empire or the overthrow of the Harbingers. It had been the conquest of despair itself. The proof that even in the darkest times, the light of hope could still shine through.